I'm Klaus Staubermann, and I will be speaking about reconstructing the past when intangible heritage meets scientific practice. I will argue today that we have seen during the past decades a successful embedding of artifacts and practices in the history of science and technology. More recently, concepts of performative knowledge, tacit knowledge, gestural knowledge, and embodied knowledge have emerged. We have observed in academia and museums a shift from what became called material culture to a more concise approach of what we call maker culture. This in turn led to a new interest by history of science and technology museums to link material and immaterial heritage. One powerful method to access, examine, and combine these various approaches are historic reconstructions, and the reconstruction method will be discussed here as a historiographic tool with the intention to bring together historic innovation processes and community practices. Can I have the first slide, please? What you see on this engraving by the Dutch inventor Schraven Zande is the absence of any practitioners in scientific illustrations. This is what made historians of science and technology aware of historic practices. Examining historic scientific practices in the history of science and technology triggered a growing interest into broader concepts of practice. The role of gestural or mechanical skills and knowledge were part of this new interest, and so were studies of visual practices, for example, in the context of magic lantern shows, visual entertainment, and early cinema, but also studies of sound and taste. A concept that was introduced by the philosopher Michael Polanyi and soon became adopted by many scholars was that of tacit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is a knowledge that is or can be difficult to communicate, for example, because of its ubiquitous or embodied nature, like, for example, riding a bike. Such knowledge is transferred from designers to users, but also into museums, and further to audiences and the public. Tacit knowledge is easily overlooked and often not recorded, and includes hidden techniques relating to the various senses, such as touch, sight, smell, or sound. It can be acquired through participation in processes and practices. Understanding historic tacit knowledge enables us to gain a deeper and new understanding of museum artifacts and the cultures these artifacts originated and formed part of. Can I have the next slide, please? Here at Paisley Museums, you see how Scottish weaving has turned into a strong focus on capturing, preserving, sharing communal practices, therefore being a good example of intangible heritage in museums. Communities often do not want their craft or technologies to be perceived as such heritage by museums, as they think this might undermine innovation processes, for example, in textile making. Or craft or technology businesses might decide to turn their own products into heritage themselves, for instance, to increase their cultural and economic status. This can be observed by active businesses that run shops or outlets, but also by museums that have their own production facilities. These businesses are keen to keep innovation processes alive. Indeed, once the production is disconnected from an innovation process, it runs the risk to become sterile or dead. Crucial element of intangible heritage, practices, skills, and knowledge is their constant redevelopment. Can I have the next slide, please? Here you see me operating a 1906 Marshall traction engine, which is a good example of how we can keep historic practices alive, but also how these can pose challenges for historians and curators of science and technology alike. The task of historians and curators of history of technology alike is to recreate the contexts that lead to the manufacture of artifacts, usually by means of archives, collections, and where possible, historic witnesses. Order books or trade catalogs can be of help too, as these tend to emphasize what was or is unique or special about an artifact. Witnesses are of particular interest to historians as they hold and can share their historic knowledge that otherwise might not have been captured or gotten lost. But how can we capture this knowledge? How can we understand it within its historic context and learn from it for the future? How do we capture the practices, skills, and techniques that enable us to understand the making and uses of artifacts? And how do we keep these practices alive, especially when these practices become part of the non-tangible documentation in the museum? Can I have the next slide, please? Reconstructing historic artifacts, such as this 19th century astrophotographic camera and associated practices, can provide us with essential information about their technical and social role at the time. Historic reconstructions over the past few decades have become a decisive tool in the history of science and technology. These cover subject areas as diverse as physics, computing, orology, communication, transport, and military. These reconstruction projects have provided historians and curators with a new and deeper understanding of the skills, practices, and tacit knowledge involved in the making and use of material culture. They analyze, for example, competing tradition in the manufacture and use of artifacts, and reflect on the changing social roles of users and inventors. They cover questions such as what can we learn from placing practices in a broader cultural context, or what are the uses of failed innovations? Can I have the next slide, please? The reconstruction of historic artifacts and the reenactment of historic practices enables us to better explore and understand historic innovation processes and keep them alive. Here, on this slide, I practice with the reconstruction of a 19th century astrophotometer invented by Carl Friedrich Söllner in Berlin. Before I replicated the photometer, I perceived it, like many historians before me, merely as an astronomical instrument and focused on features such as optics and lenses. It was the practice with the instrument that changed my perspective as a historian, considering what caused trouble while building the replica of the photometer and practicing with it. My focus changed from the more telescopic or astronomical features of the device to the features connected with creating an artificial comparison image, controlling the gas flame, or the production of the gas itself. The telescopic lens, considered at first to be the most important part of the photometer, turned out to be of only limited historic significance. By practicing with the photometer, my experience turned from an astronomical observation into a laboratory device, operating in the dark, keeping the instrument dry from condensation water, but also keeping awake at night and putting my social life on hold for the time of the project. Let me conclude. Historians, curators, and museums have become increasingly aware of the potential of understanding historic practices, craftsmanship, and innovation processes through reconstructions. Several museum projects are now underway globally. The reconstruction of historic processes as a research method can help museums to combine the top-down approach favored by historians in the past and a bottom-up approach that promotes community activities. Moreover, it enables us to redefine approaches to intangible heritage that in the past often sidelined museums and collections, and now bring together both historic understanding and inform past and future innovation processes. To both preserve and keep alive museum artifacts and practices must be at the core of any successful intangible heritage work in museums. Reconstructions can help us to achieve this. Thank you.